All right, and we are back with chapter 19, which is drifting towards disunion. Again, I'm just going to be hitting the highlights, not going into every detail from your book, but trying to help you guys focus on the major points. I'm not going to talk too much about Uncle Tom's Cabin because we did talk about that with chapter 18, but I just want to remind you again that this was a huge success. It sold millions of copies, and it's an important book because it actually got people to act on the issue of slavery instead of just talking about it, which is an important thing. But the book that I really would like to focus on is Impending Crisis of the South by Hinton Helper. This man was from North Carolina, so he was a white Southerner, but he did not own slaves, and he tried to, through this book, using a lot of statistics and information like that, to show that it's actually not a good system for whites, even in the South, and the only people benefiting from it were the wealthy planters. And this is an important book because this is a perspective that isn't even saying that slavery is morally wrong, but that it's economically hurting the South as well, which is going to be a little bit more logical to some of the people living in the South. They're going to be more willing to listen to that argument than Harriet Beecher Stowe's, because she was talking to them on a moral level and they didn't consider slavery morally wrong. So this book was really intended to try to get at the slavery issue from a logical perspective. But unfortunately, the wealthy planters who had been called out in the book were concerned that this was going to convince people to abolish slavery, so they banned it in the South, and it was a pretty hot button topic of the day. The next thing that we should talk about is Kansas. Again, just to refresh our memories, Stephen A. Douglas had worked to get popular sovereignty set up for Kansas and Nebraska, which the idea, again, is that they would get to choose their own fate in regards to slavery, so they would have a vote when they were ready. But it did not go down as people had thought it would. The South only agreed to the whole idea of popular sovereignty because they thought that one state would be slave and one would be free, thus keeping the sort of quasi-balance that they had had before this time. But abolitionists and free soilers decided they were going to move into Kansas to try to sway the vote. And the slaveholders from the South were very upset about this, so they decided to do the same thing. They moved into the territory at the time, and they started actually warring. They had actual battles that continued all the way up until the Civil War and through the Civil War. John Brown was one of the people involved in one of these things, but we'll talk about him later, so I'm not going to focus on that too much. But eventually in 1857, Kansas had finally grown their population to the size that they needed to become a state, and they decided they were going to write their constitution because they had to have a constitution to be admitted as a state. So they wrote the Lecompton Constitution, which was created by pro-slavery groups in the state, or in the future state. And instead of voting about whether or not there should be slavery at all, they just gave people the option to have the Constitution as is with slavery or without. But either way, people who were already living in the territory that owned slaves could keep their slaves. So this Constitution really upset a lot of those abolitionists and Stephen Douglas as well, because that is not what he intended when he had come up with the concept of popular sovereignty, and he felt like it was a sham of democracy and that it was not what it had been intended to be. Which brings us into the election of 1856, where popular sovereignty was another major issue along with slavery, as it had been for the past several years. And I have indicated down here on the screen how both of the parties stood on this issue. Excuse me, I didn't know that was going to happen. Clearly, I'm still learning. But the Republicans opposed slavery, and the Democrats were kind of neutral, except they wanted to keep the popular sovereignty idea. They thought it was a good idea to let people decide. James Buchanan ends up taking the win in this election. And we have already talked about the Dred Scott case somewhat with our primary sources, but Dred Scott was a slave that moved to some free states. His owner was a surgeon and had moved into the Illinois and Minnesota territories where slavery was illegal. And when his master finally died, Scott decided that he wanted to go back to Missouri, where he was originally from. But if he did, he would be seen as a slave again. So he decided that he was going to try to earn his freedom through the courts. So he sued the widow for his freedom because he had lived as a free man for 5 years. But the court ended up, the court case ended up going to the Supreme Court, and it was an important topic, not literally because everyone in the country cared specifically about Dred Scott's case as him as a person, but they cared about the implications of this case. So again, the questions of, can a slave actually sue in the U.S. Supreme Court for their freedom? Do they have the right to do that? Are they citizens at all, or are they property? And as we know from reading the primary source of Justice Roger B. Taney, he essentially makes the argument that slaves were never intended to be citizens and are not citizens. Therefore, Scott does not have the power to use the Supreme Court to earn his freedom, and that he is property and has to remain as such. The North is... Sorry, I am really yawning a lot, and I'm sorry, but I am not going to re-record this. I have already done this several times over. The North was not happy with the decision from the Dred Scott case, so I wouldn't say in total retaliation, because they probably didn't want to enforce it anyway, but they started to vocally oppose the Fugitive Slave Act and said that they weren't going to enforce it like they were supposed to. And the South essentially said that if they were not willing to enforce that act, that they were just going to leave. And John Brown, back to him, as I said, he was involved in Bleeding Kansas, and him and a faction of men who were anti-slavery, people that had moved in to try to tip the scales, ended up killing 5 pro-slavery guys, hacked them to death. And John Brown, a lot of people will call him crazy, and frankly, that's probably a little fair considering some of the violent things that he did, but he did feel very passionately about slavery and thought that it was an evil institution. And his idea to end slavery was to start a slave revolt. So his idea was that if he got an army created of freed slaves, he'd be able to get his hands on some weapons at Harper's Ferry and just kind of raid through the South, freeing slaves from plantation to plantation until they'd had enough built up that they could free all of the slaves. But he was captured, and the men with him were captured, and he was accused of treason, found guilty, and then put to death. A lot of Northerners really looked at John Brown with awe. They saw him as a martyr who was willing to put his life on the line for the abolitionist cause, which a lot of people, again, at the time, were not really quite moved into the action phase of their reform movement. They were still just kind of debating the merits of the movement and not doing much else. So John Brown to them was impressive for that reason. And for the same reason, he was also terrifying to Southerners who were already paranoid that slavery was being attacked in their country, and now it literally was being attacked in the country. And some people will point to this as a reason that the South ends up seceding, is because things like this finally push the South to their breaking point. This is just a couple of quotes showcasing the difference in opinion of John Brown in the North and the South. This is what Harriet Tubman had to say about John Brown. I've been studying and studying upon it, and it's clear to me that it wasn't John Brown that died on the gallows. When I think how he gave up his life for our people and how he never flinched, but was so brave to the end, it's clear to me that it wasn't mortal man, it was God in him. But this is Abraham Lincoln's take on it. The Brown affair, in its philosophy, corresponds with the many attempts related in history at the assassination of kings and emperors. An enthusiast broods over the oppression of a people till he fancies himself commissioned by heaven to liberate them. He ventures the attempt, which ends in little else than his own execution, which is exactly what happened with John Brown. So very eloquently put, as usual, from Abraham Lincoln. Which brings us into the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Again, we read a primary source from this series of debates. But Lincoln and Douglas were running for the same seat in the Senate of Illinois, and they rose to prominence essentially throughout the country because they were debating each other publicly, not face to face, but they would respond to each other publicly about really important topics of the day. So again, we read that speech about Lincoln's thoughts on the Dred Scott case, where he's kind of mocking Stephen Douglas for his opinions on the matter. And they talked about slavery a lot. Lincoln at one point was quoted saying, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. Either we become one or the other," which is, again, sounds a lot like he wants to get rid of slavery, but he wasn't necessarily saying that. He just didn't want slavery to expand into new territories, which is a common misconception of people. They think that Abraham Lincoln wanted to completely eradicate slavery, and that wasn't really his intention at the beginning of the war. Eventually, that is what ends up happening, but that was not his intent. Douglas thought that slavery should be decided by the people living in those territories, so again, the concept of popular sovereignty. And eventually, Lincoln got Douglas to say that his idea of popular sovereignty could be a problem for Southerners who wanted to expand slavery, and Southerners were not willing to vote for Douglas anymore because they were concerned that it was going to ruin the institution of slavery, which they depended on. All right, last major slide. At this point, the country is completely split. The slavery issue wedge has been driven heftily through the country, and when Lincoln gets elected, it is a huge outrage in the country. In a lot of the states that you can see here on this map in this turquoisey color and the blue, Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot. So when he gets elected, they were horrified, and frankly, he didn't win by very much. He only got 39% of the vote. So they felt like they were not being listened to, that their wishes were not going to be carried out in any form. So they decided they're going to secede. South Carolina is the first to secede, and many states followed quickly after, and they formed the Confederate States of America, which is where we'll pick up with Chapter 20, but I have a few maps for us to take a look at first. Also, I'm really sorry about all of the yawning. It's probably making all of you yawn at home listening to this. Okay, this is showing a map of who was in secession, in favor of secession, and who was not, which I think is kind of interesting to show that there are plenty of states and pockets within the states that were not in favor of secession. This map is showing you, again, the secession, but it shows you the number in the order of when they seceded. But notice in the purple, there were 3 or 4 states that had slavery legal that stayed with the Union. So again, another common misconception of a lot of kids that take American history. So that is the end of that, and I hope that these were helpful to all of you. Have a wonderful rest of your day or evening.